All right, so get this. Today, we are diving into some pretty wild territory.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you said this YouTube video,
Mm-hmm.
and it breaks down this whole biblical prophecy, Ezekiel 38.
Okay.
And it's not your typical Sunday school stuff.
Interesting. What's it about?
It talks about this future war against Israel. But, get this, it says some major players are going to be involved. Like, we're talking Russia, Iran.
Wow, that's
I know.
that's pretty intense.
Right.
Yeah. You know, what I find really interesting is how this video tries to connect this ancient text to like what's happening in the world right now. It's like people have always been trying to make sense of prophecies by looking at what's going on around them.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so let's break down this prophecy a bit.
Okay.
What exactly does Ezekiel 38 say is going to happen?
So basically it describes this future conflict.
Okay.
Where there's this leader, Gog, and he's from this land called Magog. And he like puts together this coalition of nations and they attack Israel. And this coalition, it includes Persia, Ethiopia, Libya, Gomer, and the House of Togarmah.
Wow. That's a lot of players.
It is. But, and here's where it gets really interesting, the prophecy also mentions these other nations like Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish. And they're like, they protest the invasion, you know, but they don't actually do anything to stop it.
Oh, so they're like hey, that's not cool. But then they just sit back and watch.
Yeah, pretty much.
Gotcha. Okay, but before we dive into who's who in this prophecy, let's back up a bit. Who was Ezekiel?
Oh, good question.
And why should we even care about something he wrote, thousands of years ago?
Yeah, that's a really important point to understand the context, right?
Yeah.
So Ezekiel, he was a Hebrew prophet, and he was living in exile in Babylon during the 6th century BC. So, like, think about it. He was writing during this time of just, like, crazy upheaval and uncertainty.
Yeah.
Like, empires were rising and falling left and right, and all of that definitely, like, shaped his prophecies.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So it's like his world is going nuts and he's writing down these prophecies, but this video is saying they apply to what's happening today.
Right.
That's a big jump.
It is. And what they do, they use historical and archaeological evidence to connect those ancient names to modern nations.
So they're saying that these names from the Bible, they represent actual countries that exist today.
Exactly.
Okay, I'm listening. Give me an example.
Okay, so like they make this really strong argument for Magog being modern-day Russia.
Wait, Russia?
Yeah.
How do they get Russia from Agog?
Okay, so they have a few points. One, they say the prophecy describes Magog as being in the farthest parts north of Israel.
Okay, geographically speaking.
Right. Which, if you think about it, kind of lines up with where Russia is, right?
Yeah, I see that.
And then they bring up this, like, archaeological finding called the Siberian Ice Princess.
The Siberian Ice Princess.
Seriously.
Yeah. It's like this ancient mummy that they found, and she was buried with all these artifacts that suggest there were these people called the Scythians.
Scythians.
Yeah, and they were living in that area, like modern-day Russia, around the time of Ezekiel.
Whoa, okay. So we got this ancient mummy in Siberia, but how does that connect to Russia being Magog?
Well, according to some historical accounts, like from the historian Josephus, they link the Scythians with the name Magog.
Gotcha. So they're like, look, the pieces fit geography, archaeology, history.
Exactly.
It all points to Russia. That's pretty clever, actually.
Right. It's interesting.
Yeah, it is. Okay, so what about this Gog character?
Right.
Who's leading this attack on Israel? Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting. This video, it says, Gog isn't actually a specific person, but more like a title, like ruler. And they suggest that, like, if this prophecy were to happen today, someone like Vladimir Putin would fit the description.
So they're not saying there's some guy named Gog running around.
Right.
But that Gog represents a powerful leader. Like Putin.
Yeah.
Wow. That adds another layer to this whole thing.
Right.
Okay. But there are a whole bunch of other nations involved in this attack too, right?
Yep.
Who are they and how do they fit into all of this?
So they basically go through each nation in the prophecy. And they try to match them up with modern day countries. Like Persia is a pretty straightforward one.
Yeah, Persia, Iran.
Exactly. It was Persian until like 1935.
Oh.
But even with something like that, where it seems simple, they bring in these interesting historical facts.
Like what?
Like, did you know that a lot of Iranians today still prefer to be called Persians?
No way. Really?
It's fascinating.
Yeah, see, this is why I love these deep dives. Always learning something new.
Me too.
Okay, so Persia is your own. What about the rest of them?
So for the rest of them, they use like historical sources, maps, all that stuff to figure out who's who. For example, they say Meshech and Tubal. They connect to modern-day Turkey.
Okay.
And they use Assyrian and Greek records to back that up.
Wow, so they really do their homework.
Oh, yeah.
Wow. Okay, what about the others?
Okay, so then there's Ethiopia, which is called Cush in the Bible.
Okay.
And they place that south of Egypt, extending into modern-day Sudan. And they base that on historical records.
Okay.
And then there's Libya, which pretty much lines up with where it is today.
Makes sense.
And finally, they connect Gomer and Togarmah to modern-day Turkey, again, using those historical sources.
Wow, so they're like meticulously mapping out this ancient prophecy onto a modern map.
Yeah, pretty much.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
But they're not just looking at geography, are they?
Right.
It seems like they're also paying attention to the relationships between these countries.
Definitely.
And like their stances towards Israel, right?
Exactly. Like, for example, they talk about the historical animosity between the Scythians, remember, that's their Magog.
Yeah, which they say is Russia.
Right, and the Persians.
Okay.
And they contrast that with the modern-day alliance between Russia and Iran.
Wow, that's a huge shift.
It is. It's like a reversal of roles.
Yeah.
And they use that to support their idea that this ancient prophecy is relevant to what's happening in the world today.
So it's not just about finding the countries on the map.
Nope.
It's about how those countries relate to each other now.
Exactly.
Especially with Israel.
Yeah, exactly. And they point to Iran's, hostility towards Israel.
Right.
And the fact that Iran is giving drones to Russia as evidence for this alliance.
Okay, so they're really building up this case. What about those nations that protested the invasion?
Yeah.
But didn't actually, help? Sheba, Dedan, and Tarshish.
Right.
Who are they in all of this?
So they connect Sheba and Dedan to modern-day Saudi Arabia.
Interesting.
Which is kind of interesting considering how their relationship with Israel has been changing lately, moving towards peace.
Yeah, that's true.
But Tarshish, that one's a bit more mysterious. They suggest it might be Britain.
Okay.
And because of Britain's relationship with the U.S., maybe the U.S. is involved too.
Okay.
But they admit that that one's a bit of a stretch.
Yeah, that makes sense. It must be hard to find an exact match for every single name in an ancient prophecy.
Definitely.
But it sounds like their main argument is that the stage is set for this prophecy to play out today.
Yeah.
With Israel at the center.
Exactly. And they actually go into detail about why they think Israel is the target, using specific verses from Ezekiel 38.
Oh, wow. Okay. I'm all ears. What do those verses say about Israel being the target?
Well, they point to descriptions of the nation under attack that sound a lot like Israel today. Like, it talks about a nation regathered from dispersion, which connects to how the Jewish people were scattered and then returned to Israel.
Right.
And it describes this wealthy nation being targeted for plunder, which, makes you think about Israel's economic success.
Yeah. Okay, I see what they're saying.
So they're arguing that these specific things mentioned in the prophecy, they make it clear that it's talking about Israel.
So Ezekiel wasn't just describing some random nation.
Right.
He was describing something that looks a lot like Israel today.
Exactly. And then to add even more to it, they bring in the idea of urgency.
Okay.
Saying that this prophecy is supposed to happen in the last days.
Wait, the last days?
Yeah.
Like the end of the world?
Yeah, and they connect it to all these current events happening globally.
Oh, hold on. So they're not just saying this prophecy is happening now. They're saying it's a sign of the end times.
That's what they're saying.
Okay, that's a pretty huge claim. So they've laid out this whole interpretation of Ezekiel 38 connected to Russia, Iran, Israel, and even the end times. What's their takeaway? Like, what do they want people to do with this information?
Well, this is where things get really interesting. They're basically calling on people to accept Jesus Christ.
Okay.
Because they see the end times approaching.
Wow. Okay. So we've gone from ancient prophecies to modern geopolitics to a full-on religious call to action.
Yeah.
This is definitely deep dive.
It is.
We've covered a lot of ground.
We have.
I think it's time to, take a breath and really dig into some of these more complex themes.
Yeah, I agree.
So we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
I think we might need a bit more than a quick word to unpack all of this.
That's true.
Yeah.
All right, we'll be right back. So before we got into all that other stuff, we were talking about how this video lays out this whole interpretation of Ezekiel 38, connecting it to modern-day nations like Russia and Iran, focusing on Israel as the target, and even bringing in the whole end times thing.
Right.
It's a lot to take in.
Yeah, it is.
And remember those nations, Sheba, Dedan, and Tarshish, the ones who protest the invasion but don't actually do anything to stop it. That part really gets me thinking.
Yeah, me too.
It's like they're watching this whole thing go down, but choose to stay out of it.
It makes you wonder, like, if this prophecy were to actually happen, would countries really just stand by and watch?
Yeah, good point.
Especially when you think about who the video says those nations represent.
Right. They said it was Saudi Arabia and maybe even Britain and the U.S.
Uh-huh.
So if even those countries are hesitant to get involved, what does that say about how the world might react to this kind of conflict?
Yeah.
Is that a good sign, is it?
Not really.
It's almost like they're saying Israel's going to be all alone if this goes down.
Yeah, and that feeling of isolation, it really plays into their message of urgency and impending doom. It's like you're saying, look, things are about to get really bad and Israel's going to be on its own.
Which I guess makes sense if you believe in the whole end times thing.
Yeah.
But if Israel is left to fend for itself, how does that work?
It's a good question.
Didn't Ezekiel 38 also talk about God intervening?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
The prophecy describes God stepping in, like, big time.
Okay.
And just unleashing chaos on the invaders, like natural disasters, infighting among the troops. The whole works.
That's intense.
Yeah, and that divine intervention, it's a really important part of their whole interpretation.
But how do they even apply that to today's world? Like, what would that even look like in a modern context?
That's a good question, and honestly, they don't really give specifics about what form it would take. But they focus more on the big picture, like God will protect Israel and judge those who go against it.
So it's like they're saying God will intervene, but they're not saying how.
Pretty much.
And leaving it open for people to decide what that might look like today.
Exactly.
Interesting. Okay, before we go too deep into that,
Yeah.
I want to go back to something we were talking about before about how this video uses historical context to make their point.
Right.
You mentioned something about being careful with making connections between past events and what's happening today.
Yeah, that's important.
Can you explain that a little more?
Sure. It's common when people interpret prophecies to try to find parallels between what happened in the past and what's happening now.
Right.
But we got to be careful about assuming history just repeats itself like in a neat and predictable way.
So you're saying that even though it's interesting to see those potential connections, we shouldn't just assume that because something happened a certain way before, it'll definitely happen that way again.
Exactly. Historical context is super important for understanding what a prophecy meant way back when.
Okay.
But trying to apply it to today's world, that takes a lot of careful thought and consideration.
Right.
We can't just assume that history is going to repeat itself.
It's like it's easy to get excited about connecting the dots and then miss the bigger picture.
It is. And that's why it's so important to think critically about these interpretations, you know?
Totally.
Like, ask yourself tough questions. Is this interpretation really backed up by what the prophecy says? Does it line up with other perspectives?
Yeah.
And maybe the most important question,
What's that?
is this interpretation promoting peace and understanding, or is it just trying to scare people and create division?
That's a good point. These prophecies shouldn't be about fear-mongering.
Right.
Or trying to prove someone right.
Exactly.
It should be about trying to understand things better and gain wisdom.
Well said.
Okay, good talk.
Yeah.
But before we get too philosophical here,
Yeah.
I do want to address one of the more controversial parts of this video.
Okay.
Their whole focus on the last days and the idea that the world as we know it is about to end.
Right. That's a big one.
They're basically saying everything we've been talking about, Russia, Iran, the potential conflict with Israel, it's all a sign that the end times are here.
That's a heavy statement.
Yeah.
And it's important to remember that there are many different ways to interpret what the last days actually means.
Okay.
Like within different Christian traditions, some people believe it's a literal end of the world, while others see it more symbolically, like a period of spiritual change or the culmination of God's plan.
Okay, so there's no one right answer to what the last days are or when they'll happen.
Right, and that's why it's so important to consider the different views on this.
Yeah.
This video presents a very specific view, one that emphasizes how soon they think these events will happen and how urgent it is to accept Jesus.
Gotcha.
But that's just one perspective among many.
Right, which brings us back to their call to action at the end, where they urge people to make a decision for Christ because they think the end is near.
And that's where things can get a little tricky, you know?
How so?
Because it's not always clear where interpreting prophecy ends
Yeah.
and pushing a specific religious agenda begins.
Right, right.
It's important to understand that their call to action comes from their own specific beliefs,
Okay.
which might not be the same for everyone.
So we have to be aware of that as we listen to their interpretation.
Absolutely.
And it's super important that we're clear about the fact that we're not endorsing any specific view here.
Right.
Our goal is to explore how people interpret prophecies
Mm-hmm.
and encourage people to think about these ideas critically.
Exactly.
We want to help you think for yourselves, not tell you what to believe.
Right.
I think we've done a pretty good job so far.
I agree.
We've looked at their claims, considered the historical and theological context, and emphasized the importance of different perspectives.
Yeah, we've even talked about some of the potential pitfalls, like jumping to conclusions about connections between the past and the present.
Totally.
It's been a really interesting conversation.
It has.
Yeah.
And we're not finished yet.
Yeah.
There's still more to unpack.
For sure.
But let's shift gears a bit before we wrap up this Ezekiel 38 deep dive.
Okay, sounds good to me.
What do you say we? All right, so we've spent a good chunk of time going through this video's take on Ezekiel 38, looking at all the historical context, the connections they make to the world today, and even their whole we're in the end times perspective.
Definitely a lot to consider.
Yeah, for sure.
It's easy to get caught up in the weeds, you know?
Totally.
Yeah.
So let's zoom out for a sec.
Okay.
Big picture time. What's the main point this video is trying to make?
Well, at the heart of it, they're saying that this ancient prophecy, it's unfolding right now. They believe all this stuff with Russia and Iran and these other countries aligning against Israel.
Yeah.
It's proof that what Ezekiel predicted thousands of years ago is happening right in front of us.
Okay. But we've also talked about being cautious about drawing those straight lines between past events and what's happening today, right? Like, history doesn't always repeat itself in such a neat and tidy way.
You got it. It's easy to see those parallels and get excited.
Yeah.
But we got to remember, history is messy. There's always more to the story.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
So how should we approach these kinds of prophetic interpretations? Like, what are some key things for our listeners to keep in mind as they're trying to make sense of all this?
Well, first and foremost, always approach these interpretations with a healthy dose of skepticism.
Okay, so don't just take everything at face value.
Exactly. Ask questions, look for other viewpoints, and really dig into the evidence.
Don't just blindly accept what you hear.
Right. Think for yourself, be critical.
I like it.
And another important thing is to remember that everyone has biases.
Oh, yeah, good point.
Even the folks making these videos.
Right.
This particular video, it's coming from an evangelical Christian viewpoint. And that's going to shape how they interpret the prophecy and what they think it means.
So we got to be aware of that lens they're looking through.
Definitely. It helps us see things more clearly.
Okay, makes sense.
And lastly, remember that prophecies aren't crystal balls.
Yeah, they're not giving us an exact play-by-play of the future.
Exactly. They're often symbolic, and there's usually room for different interpretations.
So even if we buy into the idea that these nations are lining up against Israel, we don't have to automatically assume a giant war is inevitable.
You don't.
There could be other ways things could play out.
Exactly. There's no need to jump on the doom and gloom train if that's not your thing.
I like the way you put that. So our final takeaway here is engage with these ideas, but do it thoughtfully.
With an open mind.
Yeah. Don't let fear or sensationalism take over.
Well said.
Right.
These prophecies should spark reflection and discussion,
Right.
not fear and division.
Right. They can help us understand the world better, but we need to approach them wisely. All right, well, I think that wraps up our deep dive into Ezekiel 38.
Wow.
It's been quite the journey, from ancient prophecies to modern geopolitics to even these really complex questions about faith and belief systems.
It really has. Who knew a single YouTube video could take us so far down the rabbit hole?
Right. And we hope it sparks some curiosity for our listeners.
I hope so.
Remember, this is just the starting point. Keep exploring these ideas, check out different perspectives, and talk it out with others.
Yeah, keep asking questions. And most importantly, approach these topics with a sense of wonder and a desire to understand.
Oh, I love that.
Who knows what other fascinating connections and insights are waiting to be uncovered?
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll see you next time for another exploration of your sources.